welcome to this episode of Wide Angle. Today we have with us Rahul Verma, a political scientist with the Center for Policy Research and co-author of a book called Ideology and Identity, which is about the interplay between these two major frameworks of political understanding in the Indian political landscape. Important time to have this conversation as well as we head into the last two phases of the elections of 2019. Rahul Verma, thanks very much for being with us on the show. I want to just take off from the title of your book and a very interesting cover photograph you have on it. In fact, you mentioned that right at the outset, the reason for choosing that photograph, which is essentially of a constituent assembly and the initial members of India's constituent assembly, who came from different ideological backgrounds, dispensations, beliefs, ideological, religious, identity-wise. And you're trying to send out a message by having chosen that picture. That's correct. So tell us what that message is.
So the picture on the book is basically, it's Nehru's first cabinet. The photo, I think, was taken 16th August 1947, which has Nehru right at the center. And then on the extreme right, you have Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who goes on to form Bharatiya Janasangh, which is the predecessors of Bharatiya Janata Party. And on the extreme left, you have B.R. Ambedkar.
Right.
So two ideological extremes in that sense are on the two extremes of this photograph. And everyone who's considered in some ways right-wing politician, be it Sardar Patel, Rajendra Prasad, all are in some ways like they are standing or sitting at the right of Nehru in that photograph. And the idea, so that picture, it's a tongue-in-cheek remark to sort of like use that picture to depict the ideological differences in Indian politics. And the reason, so more than the photo, it just like fell into our lap in some ways, but we were sort of struggling to think about Indian politics in some ways. Because every time, at every election, we thought there were certain recurring themes.
Right.
So such as politics of majoritarianism, such as the reservation debate. Some of these debates have old lineage, like the reservation debate started way back in 1880s, in 1906 when the Molle Minto reforms were being formed.
Right.
And I think like much of this discussion, like so when we started thinking about this book in 2013 or 2012, my advisor, who's also the co-author of this book, Pradeep Chibber, we both were just walking, and it was around 15th August, and when you're living abroad, somehow like some of these dates matter more to you, you know, and so we were just talking about certain things, and it just struck that there is a long shadow of partition on Indian politics even now.
Okay.
And that became the basis of our conversation, researching our history to think about the contemporary politics.
So that directly dives into the issue of identity, because partition was really about a religious identity dividing the subcontinent. I just want to understand that, I mean, the photograph is symbolic as well, because as you say, you have these people across an ideological spectrum in the same cabinet. The challenge was at that time to get everyone to work together, because ultimately India's strength is in its multiple identities, its multiple faiths, its multiple cultures, and therefore its multiple political ideologies. How difficult do you think it was then for them to work together in the circumstances? And do you think those difficulties, as you said, the partition continues to hold a shadow and cast a shadow, do those difficulties continue to exist today, or have they been somehow further sort of split into their own little silos?
So in some ways, Pradeep and I, when we were talking about this book around 2013 and 2014, what seemed like rise of BJP as a sudden or a surprising thing for many observers, for us it was a long historical culmination over battle, like over idea of India. So I think, and in 2013 and 2014, this phrase or term, idea of India, was used and in some ways abused even without understanding the meaning of it. So, and this term comes from like Sunil Khilnani uses this phrase from Rabindranath Tagore.
Correct.
But Khilnani in his own book...
But his book popularized the phrase, right, that's right.
And in Khilnani in his own book basically makes, like, he talks about multiple ideas of India.
Correct.
In fact, he refers to that there were different terrains, And the idea of India makes the case for him to sort of like study Indian democracy. So if there were multiple ideas about India, then that means these ideas were sort of competing force in politics. One idea had its day in 1950s and 60s, what we sort of describe as Nehruvian consensus. But that doesn't mean that consensus was shared by everyone. So there were conflicting interests in 1950s and 60s, and slowly these interests, over a period of time, these conflict basically gave rise
Right.
to.
Also, Nehruvian consensus was an idea, not necessarily an ideology.
Now, how would you differentiate?
I'm asking you. Do you see them as the same?
So the way we define ideological conflict, ideology is basically a bundle of issues.
Correct.
Right?
Okay.
And there are various issues. They may not basically, they go together in a non-random fashion. So you may care about one idea more over other, but this bundle goes together, and that's why it becomes part of your repertoire in politics. So for example, even today, even among BJP voters, you will find a section which does not share the upper caste prejudice as some upper caste voters would do.
Correct.
Or you would find even within Congress party sharing the tenets of secularism, right? But as a whole, Congress party espouses certain ideas, BJP espouses certain ideas, and Bahujan Samaj party espouses some other ideas. And their voters largely sort of like, if they
Rally around the ideas they
those
espouse.
bigger tents of
So, I mean, that's the interplay between ideology and identity, because the party itself may have an ideology. In the case of, whether the Congress, the Bahujan Samaj Party, or the BJP, the examples that you were talking about, but they also rally around individual identities,
That's
caste
correct.
identity, religious identity, as the case may be. Now, in this election campaign, this has sort of become the overriding conversation at the cost of development, at the cost of so many other roti kapda makan issues that we talk about. But your national identity supersedes your religious identity, supersedes your caste identity. What is the trajectory? Because, while we can talk about ideology and identity as two different things, they interact with each other very intrinsically, and therefore make it very complex to study Indian democracy.
That's correct. And that's why we don't like the title of the book is not ideology or identity.
Yeah.
Ideas and ideology and identities are interwoven together. In a deeply hierarchical society like India, the ideological conflicts are basically stemming out from your identities or where your position in the society is.
Correct.
And India is not alone in that sense. Somehow, and I like, pardon my language, but we have been a little bit lazy in thinking about how identities play a role in politics. So even in United States, where we think there is an ideological politics going on, if you look at their voting patterns,
It's also
Democrats
identity.
overwhelmingly
Yeah.
vote for Democrats, and white Americans vote for Republican Party. Same in United States. The working classes vote for Labour Party, and the salaried and more professional
United
class.
Kingdom, you
Yeah,
mean.
United
Yeah,
Kingdom.
yeah.
So in every place, these identities sort of like play a role in shaping politics. So even in India, when an upper caste person votes for BJP or a Dalit votes for BSP, it's not just like because I was born into so and so caste and I'm voting for that party. This relationship is not a caste party relationship, but this is a relationship where I feel that this particular party takes policy position which favors my community. So it's not a simple relationship between caste and party, but a policy relationship between caste
But
and
in the
party.
current context, you have, under the Modi government particularly, and under the current NDA, you have a narrative stemming from, including Prime Minister Modi, that says this government wants to rise above this sort of representational politics for only your community. I am talking about, I being Prime Minister Modi, I'm talking about all Indians, not just the Muslim, not just the Hindu, not just the Dalit, but everybody under one overarching tent of India. Now, is he trying to create an overarching Indian identity when the Indian identity is fundamentally a conglomerate of so many small identities?
So in some ways, populist, and especially populist of a right-wing variety, is going to create this kind of identity narrative, where they would try to basically not let the heterogeneity or the differences in the society. So they don't want to go into the pluralist model. Rather, they would suggest that there is an overarching national identity and we should care about that much more than our own
Individual identities,
identity. And this is not just limited to India. If you look at United States and other
Everywhere,
places,
yeah.
I think right now we are seeing a surge in nationalism, and in some ways not just nationalism but nativism as well, where they are trying to mobilize native identity.
So how is native identity different from national identity in that sense? How would you, because if it's the same party that's trying to mobilize both, how are they differentiating when they reach out to the electorate?
So the same party is using the both, so they don't need to differentiate.
Okay.
In America, if Republican Party is using the American identity or Native American identity, it's not any different as in India. The BJP will use the Indian identity. So when you use nativism or nationalism, so there are two ways of using it.
Yeah.
One, you are going to use it in context of othering. So you basically say there are like some people who are Indian first, and then there are second category Indians, and so you separate that.
Right.
In our case, you will see basically talking about Bangladeshi migrants or people coming from Pakistan or Nepal, and the second one is basically using the idea of nation under threat from other countries. So these are in two different contexts, but they are not separate in that.
In our case, they're also using the idea of the threat to the nation, not just from the identity spectrum, but also the ideological spectrum, which is the liberal, progressive, the secular, language that we hear. That's also, I mean, how does that fit into your paradigm?
So in our book, we basically use two axes of ideological conflict. One we call as politics of recognition. Recognition in a sense whether you are going to let these groups have their individual identity,
Right.
and get share in political and economic sphere. The second one is basically treating them as homogeneous whole
Within the state.
within the state,
Right.
right? So that's what BJP is, anti-politics of recognition. They would talk about India as a whole, whereas there would be parties like Congress or left or BSP, they would say that you should have multiple identities, and those identities should have very different needs, and that's how they should
And
be.
yet it's not so simple, because while the BJP might be against the politics of recognition as a whole, it is recognizing one overarching identity, which is both national and native,
That's correct.
which is the Hindu identity
correct.
as the
That's-
dominant one.
that's correct.
And that brings us to the other question about these elections. I mean, these are, I've covered elections since 1996. I'm dating myself over here and aging myself, but nonetheless, and I cannot remember an election in which majoritarianism as a term, as a concept, or populism as a concept has crept into the Indian political discourse in a way that the 2019 election is showing us. Now, people will argue that if democracy is the will of the majority, then what is majoritarianism? It's the will of the people. And, when put that simply, you are caught in an explanatory or defensive mode about saying that no, what we mean is ABC about majoritarianism. It's about imposing the will of the people on those who don't necessarily support you or vote for you. But it's becoming a difficult definition to adhere
That's
to.
correct. That's correct. So couple of points. One, democracy is not only about will of majority. That's half the definition about democracy.
Right.
Democracy also entails protection of minority rights, and so unless you have the second thing, the definition of democracy is not complete. Second, I think when we talk, like some people use the term majority, so will of majority extended to majoritarianism is basically imposing certain kind of ideas, which is a majoritarian idea. In that sense, you are not a plural democracy, but you are becoming a democracy which only represents a certain kind of majoritarian idea. So in Indian case, it will be a Hindu majoritarian idea, which also flows from upper caste ideas about politics, right? So in that sense, you are basically moving towards, yes, it is will of majority, but then the sensibilities are upper caste politics. The second point, and I absolutely agree with you, no denial on that front. I think 2019 campaign in that sense is one of the most ideological and also one of the most polarizing campaign fought so far. It's much more than 1996 election or 1991 election, which was fought in the backdrop of Ram Mandir mobilization. And this is what is happening. Basically, 2014 in some ways was a critical election, which basically changed the configurations of social power in India. Now, what we are, and we will figure out on 23rd whether the competitive space which was reorganized on in 2014, whether 2019 will basically continue that system or not. Virtually for all practical purposes, since 2014, we are in the fourth party system, which is being led by the BJP. So BJP is the focal point of all competition since 2014.
And yet we're seeing another trend, which we've seen since I think maybe 89 and onwards, and certainly from the Third Front government in 96, which is regionalism. We've seen regional leaders and regional political parties rally on the basis of identity as opposed to ideology, because they might all be, I mean, one can even argue that as far as ideology is concerned, Modi-nomics, the way we see it today, which is also about the language of the upliftment of the poor and, delivery schemes to the poor, is in a sense this garibon ka masiha, which is left economics, and right-wing ideology kind of coming together. So that line is getting a little blurred. But coming to the issue of regional players, they are also rallying on the basis of regional identity, which is overriding caste identity or religious identity. It's linguistic, it's regional, it's cultural, as the overarching identity. So you have this majoritarian sort of
North
basis,
Indian Hindu majority.
and you have this regionalism, which is kind of now competing with each other. What does that do to say what used to be Nehruvian consensus, which the Congress still claims as its own legacy ideology?
So, Nehruvian consensus had certain parameters. One was basically built on diversity, democracy, and development for all. So, basically, creating a kind of polity where you can bring in diverse group together in a very democratic fashion and then ensure development for all these groups, right? That was the Nehruvian framework. Now, that Nehruvian framework, even then it was challenged. It's another matter that the Nehruvian consensus, because one of the towering personality of Nehru at that time, and second, many people who were sort of challenging this consensus either died or basically couldn't gain electoral weight to challenge him.
Right.
So Nehruvian consensus was challenged both from the right as well as from the left. Right? Even at the height of Nehru's popularity, Congress party never crossed 50% of vote shares. So that means there were a lot of voters as well as lot of leaders who were opposing Nehru and the Congress party. The biggest fight in 1950s within the Congress party was over the Hindu Code Bill. In some ways, that's basically you would call a conservative and a liberal politics, whether giving equal right to women in the society or not. And the second biggest fight was happening on the question of regionalism. In fact, Nehru for a long period of time was not very comfortable with the reorganization of states and other things. And it was only after many leaders in these states thought that they are not getting their due. Some of them went unto fast unto death, which forced Nehru to sort of like go for the first lead.
To their demands
so
as well,
regional identity in that sense is not devoid of the idea of recognition, where in some ways you were not like recognizing those regional differences and giving them their due share.
Okay.
And many of these regional parties, mind you, from 1960s to 1980s, when we see an emergence of lots of regional parties, these are not just like mobilizing on the basis of regionalism. They are also using caste, and they are also using reservation as a platform. So many of these regional or state level parties are also backward caste parties.
So, Rahul, we're running out of time, but as a concluding question, I'd like to ask you, you said that the 2019 election is in a sense a defining election because of the sort of fight or the contradictions between the various ideologies that India has espoused and the identity politics that we have seen play out and now is working on a different track. Let's assume we're on the 24th of May. We don't know what's going to happen. We're not even going to try and predict this election result. But do you think that the challenge that we see this election posing to plural democracy now needs to be reassessed after these election results come? Do we need to start an engagement and a conversation perhaps about proportionate representation in our democratic space, in our parliamentary space? Otherwise, will we be able to create an overarching Indian identity above all these other pressures? I mean, what do you see happen?
One, we are too late for this conversation now.
Okay.
This conversation should have begun much earlier. And people may not like this thing, but you can't begin a conversation about rules of the game after losing the game.
Right.
Right? If you remember, like in 60s and 70s, Vajpayee was making this claim that we should have a proportional representation because the right-wing parties were getting 10 to 15% of vote share, but they hardly had any representation in the parliament. So you cannot expect the winner to change the game or the rules of the game, which is going to hurt them.
Right.
So in some ways, this conversation about...
it's about 5 decades too late.
Yes, 5 decades too, at least on the electoral front. Also, I think on the... So this election is definitely a high stakes election, as Pratap Mehta would say, but a low expectation election also. I think the rules of the game, not just about the electoral system, but the competitive party system that will flow out from 2014 is already in motion. And I think many people, including Yogendra Yadav and others, have been saying this. See, what is happening at the moment, at least in electoral politics, the opposition, the opposition to BJP, Modi, or the kind of politics they practice, is very opportunistic alliances and very opportunistic opposition. I think many people have been talking about we need to sort of like
rise above opportunistic politics as well.
So what I agree with you that we need to engage in a conversation, but the conversation has to think about an alternative mode of challenging the hegemony that is being created. Even if, and that's why I think like we need to be sort of not just cautious, but also have some expectation that the electoral defeat or electoral decline will not sort of like some kind of politics is already in motion. Paradoxically, big electoral defeat may sort of like cut down the pace with which majoritarian politics is sort of progressing, but it would not completely reverse the cycle.
And I think that's the real challenge because the cycle is here to stay. How can you engage with the conversation? Because I think that we've seen the polarization, as you said, of this campaign also just push people to extremes and leave this wide space in the center which is empty. It's devoid of engagement and devoid of conversation. And irrespective of the result on the 23rd of May, I think one has to sort of pay attention to the fact that whatever space is lost, is it possible to reclaim it? Is it possible to find a way back to the center? And this is a conversation the left and the right both need to engage in at the same time. It's not about just pointing fingers at the other side. Rahul Verma, thanks so much for speaking to The Wire. I really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.